In this episode, I'm speaking with Mitchell Clionsky, who is the co-author, with his wife, of the book Dementia Prevention, Using Your Head to Save Your Brain. This is a topic that many of us will have to deal with. It may be an aging parent, a spouse, or yourself. It's a fascinating topic on what you can do now to prevent dementia. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 332 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I'm speaking with Mitchell Clionsky, who is the co-author, with his wife, of the book Dementia Prevention, Using Your Head to Save Your Brain. This is a topic that many of us will have to deal with. It may be an aging parent, a spouse, or yourself. It's a fascinating topic on what you can do now to prevent dementia. Let me read the author's bios. Mitchell Clionsky, Ph.D., is a board-certified neurophysiologist who specializes in evaluating and treating patients with cognitive impairment, dementia, ADHD, and traumatic brain injury. Emily Clionsky, M.D., completed residencies in internal medicine and in psychiatry and is a diplomate of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. She specializes in the care of patients with cognitive impairments. They have combined 70 years of professional clinical experience in medicine and neuropsychology and have treated 20,000 patients. They partner at a private practice, Clionsky Neuro Systems, Inc., based in Springfield, Massachusetts. They are experienced public speakers, podcast guests, and workshop presenters for general and professional audiences. This is a topic that has touched my life. My mother died in her mid-80s with dementia, and her last few years were not pleasant due to the dementia. My son's mother-in-law started showing signs of dementia about a dozen years ago when she was in her late 50s. She is now in her late 60s and requires full nursing home care. This is a debilitating condition, and for some, this is preventable. This episode is sponsored by Career Pivot Community, but more on that later. Unfortunately, Mitchell recorded this discussion using the microphone in his computer by mistake. I've cleaned up the audio quite a bit, but still not quite up to my usual standards. Without delay, let's get to my discussion with Mitchell Clionsky. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. I have the real joy of having Mitchell Clionsky on the podcast, and he is one of the co-authors of Dementia Prevention, Using Your Head to Save Your Brain. Welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure being here, Mark. Looking forward to talking with you.
Why did you write the book, and why did you write the book now?
The why did we write the book is primarily to take this growing body of information from all different areas. So it's not just neurology, it's not just psychiatry, it's not just mental health kinds of things, but looking at heart-related disorders, looking at sleep and breathing-related disorders, medications that people take, all the various things that can impact our risk of developing a progressive neurological condition, which is what dementia is. And being able to put it together, first of all, to take all this wide-ranging information, because most of the specialists in each area rarely read what the others have written. So there's a lot of people not paying attention to the other factors. We wanted to bring it all together. We wanted to then translate the science into language that most everyone could appreciate without dumbing it down. So there's a difference here. We use technical terms, but then we explain the technical terms. We also use some illustrations and a lot of case examples and stories to try to bring life to this. So it makes it interesting and it doesn't become a book on how do I fall asleep at night, which, obviously that could happen if the book isn't interesting enough. But we wanted to bring something together that was scientifically sound. It wasn't based on a lot of, fads or eat this, don't eat that kinds of approaches. Translate it, put it together in a way that people reading the book or listening to the book, because it's an audiobook, could then do a self-assessment, figure out where their strengths and weaknesses are, and most importantly, to then use that information and ways to make changes so that they could then adjust their risk, lower their risk, stack the deck in their favor so they didn't get demented as they grew older. So that's really the why behind a lot of this. Why now is it was the right time. I've been practicing clinical neuropsychology, testing hundreds of people every year for memory disorders, going on now for about 45 years. My wife, first author of the book, Emily Clionsky, is a physician, was first an internal medicine doctor, practiced internal medicine for several years, decided she wanted to go to psychiatry residency, finished the psychiatry residency and got interested in dementia. This was before we were together. We then got together, and it just so happens that we were on the same pathway and started practicing side-by-side practices and sharing a lot of patients. And realized that the things that were working for us in treating patients were things that could be used to help people earlier in the stage of thinking decline and hopefully before they began to lose anything. So that's what the why now is. It was the right time. She's been out there for 25 years. I was doing it for 45 years, and we're not getting any younger. It's time to really act on some of this rather than looking back and say, wow, I wish I had.
My mother, my mother was very old when I was born. She was nearly 40, which for the mid-1950s was unheard of. So I took care of my mother as she passed, and on her death certificate says Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
We know she had short-term memory loss, big time, which is a form of dementia. How would they know that it's Alzheimer's? Or what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's?
And that's really a great question. In fact, it's usually the number one question that people raise their hands when we do talks. The difference is that Alzheimer's is a brand of dementia. Think about Ford being a brand of automobile. You also have Toyotas and maybe still Buicks, I can't remember, Cadillacs, Mercedes, Well, Alzheimer's is the most well-known form, but not necessarily the largest type of dementia. A lot of dementias come from vascular factors, circulation, blood and oxygen not getting as well as it should to the very endpoints of the branches of your blood vessels in your brain. It could also be a consequence of Parkinson's disease. Turns out about 25 to 30% of people with Parkinson's disease develop dementia. You can also get demented from getting your head hit too many times. You can get dementia from drinking too much alcohol for too many years. There's also some viral encephalopathies. You get bitten by a tick and end up with an encephalopathy, an inflammation of your brain. And then there's what Bruce Willis has, which is a different kind of dementia, but it's also shares some similarities, which is called frontotemporal dementia, which usually is much younger. Because for most dementias, the risk in your 60s is only about 10%. That doubles by the time you get into your mid-70s, doubles again up to about 40% when you get into your mid-80s. So with more and more people living longer and longer, we're naturally seeing a whole lot more people who have one form or another of dementia. Back when your mom died, that was the number one label that they used, barring all others. They said, well, it's Alzheimer's disease. So that's why she got that. And if she didn't have, strokes and heart attacks and a lot of blood pressure problems if they didn't know what else it was, that was probably a pretty good diagnosis, given that she started out with you rather late. So my guess is she was probably in her 70s or 80s when she started having memory problems.
Yeah, I remember taking her to her neurologist, who was explaining to me that, when someone's 70, there's as you say, a 10 or 20% chance of having dementia of some form. By the time they hit 80, it goes up a lot. And we lived in a neighborhood for many years where, when we first moved in the early 80s, where everybody was retired, we were one of the few people on the block who worked. And over the next 20 years, I watched the number of my neighbors experience dementia, mostly when they hit the magic age of 80.
Yep, risk really goes up. And what's interesting about this whole field for me is the fact that while we can look at the numbers and say this is the risk, that's the risk for people who really are not trying to do anything to prevent it. That's just the general risk. And unfortunately, most people view dementia as being, the fickle finger of fate or something that's genetic. So they would look at your history or my history, because my mom had dementia, and say, well, you're going to get it because you had a parent who had it. Now, in some families, there are very large numbers of people who have dementia that's genetically caused. Usually they get it in their 50s. So it's a very specific type of gene. But for the vast majority of people, it doesn't appear to have a strong genetic element, which is why we get into the whole idea of what else is contributing. And when we start looking at that, which was the whole purpose of our book, then you start figuring out, and you look at the science, you look at some very large-scale studies, one being what they call the Lancet Commission in Great Britain, which was about 28 different scientists, looked at all of the various causes for cognitive decline. They came up with this list of 12 things. And in 2017, they published this. They determined that 40% of dementias were preventable based on those factors. They redid it about 3 years later. I think they added hearing loss at that time. The percentage went up a couple percent. A couple years after that, in 2022, there was a group in the United States that applied the same statistics to the Health and Retirement Survey, and they came up with a 60% number. So then you got two different groups ranging from 40 to 60%, which is why we say that 1 out of 2 cases of dementia is preventable. And the question is figuring out what you can do to be part of the 1 rather than part of the 2.
Yeah, I found interesting. Obviously, you have a whole section on lifestyle factors. Obviously, smoking, which makes sense because it deprives oxygen to the brain. What I found interesting was the diet, that there's no magic pill or magic diet that will prevent this.
And that's what people sell a lot of books on. If you look at the listings, there's always a couple diet books ahead of our books in the rankings. And I don't know how they could cook books. So you can cook an Alzheimer's diet. I mean, it sounds appealing. And most of our readers are American. And we in America like to eat our way into health by finding the right food, the right pill, the right additive. And we want something that's quick, that's easy, to just add water, it's going to make it better. And it doesn't. And they keep looking for this. You'll see a lot of different clickbait kinds of things on the internet. These 3 foods will lower your risk of dementia. About the only thing so then it gets to things like, oh, I want flavonoids. So I want, chocolate, and we want certain kinds of vegetables. And other people say, no, it's olive oil rather than butter. And there's a point to be made for that. Other people say it's full of legumes. Well, it just came out with this new study on what's been called the MIND diet, which is a combination of the Mediterranean diet and I forget what the other diet is, but it's related to that. And this is supposed to be like the perfect diet. And the most recent evidence suggests that it really did not change the risk of dementia. Now, I'm not telling people to eat bad stuff. I'm not saying go out and binge on prepared foods. and don't feel your food through a drive-through kind of place. But it does say that there isn't a magic food, and eating itself, other than using it as a weight control measure, because obesity is a cause for dementia, that's going to change anything. That you'd be far better off putting your efforts into other things that can adjust your risk.
This episode is sponsored by the Career Pivot membership community. The Career Pivot membership community is a group of people from all over the U.S. and Canada with diverse backgrounds. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out figure out what they want to do in the second half of life and then make it happen. Many have made changes that they did not know existed or was possible when they came to the community. They learn from each other and broaden their horizons on what was really possible. Let's hear what Vicky had to say about being part of the community.
For me, I would say it's the resources that you've made available to the community, whether it's bringing on speakers who have insights into the current hiring and job searching trends, especially during the pandemic. This has been so useful. Highlighting companies that are providing remote work for older adults. And again, this is how I was able to get my current part-time job, but also helping me to see new possibilities about what work might look like now and in the immediate future, because, this is so important. The traditional jobs that our generation was raised with have essentially evaporated. And so that's really what's been most helpful to me most recently.
You can't just join the community. I bring people into the community every few months in groups. You can sign up for the waiting list, so when I open the door for new members, you'll be notified. If you're interested in learning more about the endeavor and sign up for the waiting list, please go to careerpivot.com/community. Now, back to the episode. Yeah, obviously, diet and exercise, keeping weight off. I mean, that's the one thing. I've worked in 40 different countries. I remember I had an employee back at my first tech startup. I sent her off to Korea and to teach a class, and she came back, and it's the first time she'd been outside the U.S. And she said, "Wow, Americans are fat."
We are. Obesity is a tremendous problem. And, when you get, I call it the third rail of healthcare, because it's one of those things you don't want to touch because it sets off a lot of emotional reaction. People say, you're shaming me, or this is the size that I am, and why are you doing this? And I tell them, it's not me, it's your brain. Your brain is saying to you, I want you to be a size that your body was made to have. Because when you've got more of you than you were designed for, your body's got to work extra hard. It's got to clear more fat and sugars. It's got to, in some way, manage the increase in your blood pressure. It's got to manage the increase in your blood sugars. It's got to somehow get you past the idea that now walking or running or exercising is hard and it's fatiguing and it's painful and your knees are going to give out. So don't blame me, blame your brain. It's telling you that this is probably not the size you were destined to be. And the closer you can get to what you should be, the happier your brain's going to be. And that usually has a different approach to it. That they say, okay, I get what you're saying. But it's not easy for sure. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And perhaps some of the new diabetes injectable drugs, the semaglutides and some of the other pills like Wegovy and Ozempic, those may actually make a big difference in this epidemic. I had a patient who was in his late 70s and has had a horrible time with his weight over the years. And consequently, he's had a lot of other medical problems. Came to me because of concentration and memory problems, and I diagnosed him with mild cognitive impairment. MCI, or mild cognitive impairment, is like a wake-up call on your way to dementia. It's the precursor stage. And we talked about why his diabetes was a major risk, why his untreated sleep apnea was a major risk. And he went to his doctor. He got a CPAP mask machine for his sleep apnea. He had been trying to die for years, but he got this new medication, this Ozempic. And when I saw him a couple of weeks later, he said, this is pretty amazing. It's the first time in my life when I have felt full. It stopped me in my tracks because I really had not put it in those terms before. And I asked them a little more. They said, I finish a meal, I feel hungry. I want to know what I can eat for my next meal. It's a very different experience from people who don't experience that type of obesity, where they eat a meal and say, well, that's enough for tonight. I'm good. He was always looking. He was like a shark looking for the next prey because he never felt satisfied. And he said, this is amazing. In the first couple of weeks, he was on the lowest dose. He dropped 5 pounds. He said, because I just didn't feel like I needed to eat anymore. So I'm pretty excited about this, a whole lot more so than the surgeries, the gastric sleeves and the other kinds of surgeries to reduce the size of your stomach, which, it's major surgery and it's pretty much the same for the rest of your life. This is pretty interesting stuff.
Well, you bring up the other interesting thing that I learned in reading the book is how much sleep deprivation and sleep apnea, which makes total sense because basically sleep apnea is you stop breathing and you wake up, and how that would further your possibilities of dementia.
Absolutely. It's the lack of oxygen that you get from stopping breathing multiple times every hour. The tough thing about it is a lot of people don't know that they have it or don't want to treat it or even identify it because they don't like the idea of having to use a continuous positive airway pressure, a CPAP machine, to treat it. They look at it as being something that's horrible. Having used one myself in the past 17 years every night, I can tell you that it's definitely not horrible. You just have to sort of wrap your head around the concept, realize that now you're going to get a lot of oxygen to your brain that you didn't get before. And I see people all the time who, after we identify and treat these people for their sleep apnea, their cognitive functioning improves on standardized tests. They have better concentration, better memory. They have more energy. They start then being able to exercise. They start then being able to go on and do new things. So oxygen, who knew? But it starts with breathing. And that's the whole thing. When we talk about sleep apnea, it's not so much about the sleep, although sleep itself is important. It's about your breathing while you sleep that deprives, if you're not getting oxygen, enough air down your lungs, then your lungs are not pulling enough oxygen out of the air because oxygen is only about 20% of the air. And they have to attach those oxygen molecules to the red blood cells that go up through your arteries and down to the capillaries into the very tips of your brain. And the value of this is those parts of your brain get the nutrients they need to work well. Secondly, they then can make an energy molecule called adenosine triphosphate, ATP, that you don't get if you don't have oxygen, which is why people with sleep apnea are tired all the time. And we've discovered a couple of years ago, there's a system in our body we didn't know about called the glymphatic system. It begins with a G, not the lymphatic, the glymphatic system. Very, very thin layer of tissue. Its whole job is to flush out the byproducts of thinking. So it's like you're working at your desk during the day, and somebody comes in at night while you're sleeping and cleans up and empties your trash can. That doesn't work if there's not enough oxygen in your brain, which is why it's got to start with breathing.
The other piece that I wanted to talk about was what came out of the pandemic, which was the social isolation. I found the couple of different things. Social isolation, hearing loss.
Yes.
By the way, it took a long time, but I finally got my wife to get hearing aids.
So how's that working out for you?
Oh, it has improved things dramatically. And I remember She got them back in 2019. I remember having a conversation with my friend Alex Freund up in Princeton, New Jersey, talking about the fact that Alex had hearing aids and he was in his 80s. And he said 95% of Americans who need visual aids get them.
Yep.
But a very small percentage of people who need hearing aids get them.
In fact, that's absolutely true. There are people who wear glasses but don't have visual loss. It's a fashion statement. I mean, when I was a kid, and maybe when you were a kid, because I'm older than you are, you didn't want to wear glasses because people would tease you. But they have become so mainstream that they now are very cool, and they make me look smarter than I am. So I always want to wear mine. The hearing aids, however, it's really taken the technological advance and miniaturization to make them something that has changed over the course of my career in dealing with patients. Because earlier on, a lot of people said, I don't want to wear hearing aids because they'll make me look old. And I'd say to them, you know what makes you look old? They'd say, what? I'd say, exactly. What? That repeated kind of asking somebody to speak up, that really makes you look old. Well, I don't have to go through that quite as much anymore because now most people can't even tell that you're wearing them when you have them in. And it does make a difference. It changes the way in which your brain is able to be nourished by the background sounds. So it makes for a thicker surface to the brain, better connection to what's called the auditory association cortex, part of the brain that's linked to your memory. It also helps to improve this resting state of connectivity in different parts of the brain and alert you to the fact that something's going on. So you now pay attention to it, even though before you would not. So that's what the Lancet Commission decided accounted for about 3% additional benefit in terms of reducing risk of dementia. It's very important. And thank goodness people can now buy it online. I send them to big box stores to get it. I don't even tell them to go to somebody who has to make their living selling hearing aids. Go someplace where they're not being incentivized to sell you a hearing aid. Get your test there and then shop around for the cheapest price.
Yeah. I mean, my wife's hearing aids, you can't even tell that she's wearing hearing aids.
That's right. Yep.
And so, and again, going back to the whole social isolation, because this is one of the things that I've been promoting in the fact that many of us in of our age demographic, and I'm about 5 years younger than you, is the fact that we were told to go socially isolate during the pandemic. And a lot of folks have got to be a really bad habit.
I've seen a lot of people who view that as being a seminal event in terms of the beginnings of problems they were having in thinking. And it also may be that by the time I get to see someone, usually they've been having memory problems for a couple of years. So there's a coincidence there that they attribute to the pandemic. Well, what I find interesting, though, is here we're having this great conversation. The audience can't see us, but we're seeing each other. You're far away from me, a different time zone, different country. And so while it took away in the fact that we can't shake hands today because we're distant, I could see you. And before that, I didn't have the capacity to connect with my friends from high school every couple months when one of us is celebrating a birthday. We'd see each other once every 3 years. Now we see each other, it's limited, but it's on Zoom. We see each other every 3 months or 2 months, which is really great. So part of it is what you make of it. And I think that it's important to say, okay, I can't get around this way. Let me find a different way of increasing my social contact. Let me seek out other people who are online that I can talk to. Let me be part of that group. I now go to conferences, get continuing education where I don't have to travel to Los Angeles for something I want to see because I can do it online. But it's the connectivity that's really, really important. And it's hard for some people because all of their social contact came from work. So retirement becomes a huge challenge for them. And very few people prepare for that.
Yeah, there's no question. Where I live is a huge expat community. Lots of people come here to retire, and many fail at retirement.
I'm sorry, you failed at retirement.
Well, it's a combination of, they go one of two ways. They either go back to work. We have a lot of folks who become realtors and they do new things, or they start drinking.
Yes.
There's a lot of alcohol consumption here.
And that often happens no matter in any retirement community. The pressures of having to be sober for a business activity, and you want to be social, and you can start having cocktails with lunch or even earlier. And, it just sort of goes into a habitual kind of pattern. Alcohol, there's a real debate about, is all alcohol bad for you? Are there alcohols that are good for you? How's the amount that you drink? So what we talk about is, number one, avoiding binge drinking.
Yeah,
that's a big problem and really creates stresses on your brain. But from an ongoing drink on a daily or frequent basis, it's a matter of how much. And rather than asking people, how many drinks do you have? I also ask them, what do you drink? What's the size of the drink? I tell them, don't pour liquor like your neuropsychologist does. Use a shot glass because you're going to have a lot more control. They say, well, I only drink wine. I said, well, 4 to 5 ounces of wine is equivalent of a shot of hard liquor. It's the equivalent of 12 to 16 ounces of beer. And they say, well, I just drink light beer. I said, well, it's the same alcohol content in those cases. And if you're drinking craft beers, it's actually twice the content. So you have to count that in as well and figure out, what am I really drinking and what level is really good for me?
Yeah, really what it comes down to when I was reading through the book is the fact that it comes about to having a healthy lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of moderation.
Right. And I mean, that's the one thing. We moved to Mexico 5 years ago. And it's first time we went back, my wife's first comment to me was, every time I walk in a store, I have sugar shoved in my face. And the fact is, the American eating habits and I call it the factory food system is pretty darn unhealthy.
Yes.
And that's where you end up with obesity, which then leads to type 2 diabetes, which leads to all kinds of sleep apnea. I'm sitting here looking at your chart where everything's connected, right? Yes. And it really is really complex. There are lots of things that if you're just simply living a healthy lifestyle, you probably can reduce a lot of your risk for dementia.
One of the reasons we have that chart at about the 6th chapter where we're talking about the various risks, because the model builds, as you know,
yes,
one factor at a time, because if that's what you'd see, I'll start talks and I'll say, here's what dementia prevention is all about. What do you think? And everyone in the audience looks at me and their jaw drops and they say, we're going to not start there. Let me pull out this. So I start with a simple graph and we build it over time. The cool thing about that, all the interconnectedness is correct. But what's also cool about it is if you make changes in a couple areas, it has the opposite effect. It actually undoes some of those others. So if it's excessive consumption of carbohydrates and sugars, and you change that and really modify your diet, you start losing weight. You say, I can really walk farther now. I'm going to do a lot more walking. You start sleeping better. Maybe your chances of sleep apnea are lower. Although once you get over the age of 70, weight is not such a big issue anymore. It has to do with the strength of the muscles in your neck and the size of your airway. So you can't necessarily diet your way out of sleep apnea. In some cases you can, especially if you're young. But then you feel like doing things, you get out more, you start seeing people. So there's this whole connectivity that works in both directions, and you just have to find a place to pull on the strings, so to speak, and untangle it.
Well, let's finish on that note, because that's because it really is. It's my mother had dementia. My son's mother-in-law started having dementia in her late 50s. And this can happen literally at any age. You just simply take care of yourself.
Well, let me leave you with one thought then, which is one of the phrases we use in the book, which is we encourage people to stop being dementia worriers and to start being prevention warriors.
Yep.
That it's the active approach that we're really pushing, because that will make a difference and will mean that we do this at a large scale. If we could somehow start a movement to dementia prevention, we're going to have a whole lot less people in nursing homes with dementia. We're going to have a whole lot healthier aging as we get into our 70s and 80s and even beyond.
So, Mitch, if someone wanted to reach out and contact you and buy your book, how might they do that?
There's a couple of different things. First of all, to reach out and contact us, you go to our website, which is BrainDoc, BrainDoc.com. I think that the book, we set up a particular questions at BrainDoc.com if someone wanted to email. The book is pretty much everywhere these days. It's in Poland. I saw an advertisement on the internet. It's in English, but it's being sold in Poland. But it's on Amazon, it's in Barnes & Noble. You can get through Johns Hopkins Press. That's our publisher. It's on Kindle. It's on iPad. It's on audiobooks. Very nice narrator named Nan McNamara does a great job of reading the book. So, and there's a link through our website as well. So it's a lot of different places. The important thing is dementia prevention, using your head to save your brain.
And I will include all of that in the show notes.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark.
Mitchell, thank you very much for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
My pleasure. Love to come back whenever you are in the mood.
I learned a lot from reading the book in my discussion with Mitchell. I will include the image from the book that shows all the dependencies in the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-332. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You will get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. When you subscribe, you will receive my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-332. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of the Repurpose Your Career podcast.